She said that Sharon Tate cried for her mother, that Abigail Folger had run from the house, and Tex ran over and gutted her, basically.
On the lawn up there, yeah.
And then went back to killing the man. That she told Sharon Tate that she had no mercy for her, called her a bitch, and she didn't care if she was pregnant. And she said, I stabbed her until she stopped screaming.
Could you have been, if you were a little older, indoctrinated to the point where you participated in murder also? Or was there something different about your upbringing, your value system, despite the twisting that it underwent?
The difference, I would think, is that they didn't seem to care about the suffering of the victims. And I did. And it was something I just couldn't fathom, that you could do that.
So your weakness, in quotations, was to be more human than they?
I guess so. Because I just couldn't fathom hurting people like that. I mean, they butchered them.
Yeah.
After I overheard the Tate murders being discussed, I knew I had to get out of there. You know, I really put all my efforts and every bit of my conscious abilities in trying to get out.
Barbara Hoyt, still a naive teenager, is able to break Manson's evil spell. What's fascinating is how Manson's insights into human behavior allowed him to handpick the members who were truly broken down by his relentless manipulation. These individuals were capable of justifying the pain and suffering of others in the name of Manson's cause. But even as a spectator on the ranch, Barbara's moral compass just wouldn't permit such corruption.
Barbara Hoyt escaped Barker Ranch by walking 43 kilometers through the desert. A few weeks later, Manson and the other killers were arrested. Bugliosi saw Hoyt's testimony as a crucial part of his case. But Manson maintained his ruthless control over the family. Hoyt received death threats from the cult, and they demanded she flee to Hawaii.
I always cooperated with the police, but I was very frightened to testify because of all the death threats. I didn't go to Hawaii, as some people said, just to avoid testifying. I was trying to keep them from killing my family.
Manson family member Ruth Ann Morehouse took Hoyt out of town and away from the trial.
I was scared to take the subpoena. I was very frightened to testify. I was constantly being threatened. Your family's going to die. What could be done there could be repeated at your house. I was always threatened. And that's why I went with them to Hawaii, because I was afraid they'd hurt my family. So.
Which God knows they were certainly capable of doing.
Yeah.
While the two were traveling in Hawaii, Ruth Ann Morehouse offered Barbara Hoyt a hamburger.
I ate the hamburger, and she said to me as she was getting on the plane, just imagine if there were 10 tabs of acid in that hamburger. I started getting higher and higher, and I couldn't figure out why. And I kept hearing in my head her saying, just imagine if there were 10 tabs of acid on it. Just imagine. It just kind of went over and over and over again in my head. And finally it dawned on me, there were 10 tabs of acid.
It was a potentially lethal dose of LSD.
When I got to the hospital, I told him to call Mr. Bugliosi, because now I'm realizing what's going on. So I started telling everybody my name, my address, my zip code, anything I could think of. I wanted to be identified. I didn't want to be a Jane Doe.
Hoyt recovered, and when she was released from hospital, she immediately returned to Los Angeles.
It was within 2 weeks that I testified. I was not afraid to testify at that point. I was of a single purpose by then. I knew what I needed to do.
But even in the courtroom, Manson tried to control his former family member.
Charlie was trying to get me to answer questions one way, like, say no, like this, say no. And I said, well, yes, because the answer was yes.
Barbara Hoyt's testimony was damning for Manson. From prison, he ordered his followers to proclaim his innocence and demonstrate their devotion to the world.
At the very end, he did everything he could to save his life and get the girls to take on more than they actually did so that he wouldn't get a death penalty. He did not want to go to the gas chamber.
No acts of devotion were too extreme for the family.
And we crawled on our hands and knees all the way from the Sunset Strip to the courthouse. And I didn't think anybody took pictures of it. There I am.
What seemed to be the meaning of that?
To show the devotion that we had to Charles Manson. I mean, it was to the point where, you just do it. There's just no way out.
How can you say that there's no question of his innocence?
Well, the newspapers now are dropping the word alleged. I can say anything I want to say.
You were expected to say certain things, and so you did.
What did you think you were expected to say?
And that he was innocent. We said he was innocence because in our mind, he was pure. Whatever he did, he was still innocence.
Beautiful, Charlie. Are you all happy with your court?
Susan Atkins, Patricia Krimwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten, they took it upon themselves to try to save Charlie Manson's life and say that he had nothing to do with it.
Right.
This concocted story.
This is essentially what ingrained Manson in the nation's consciousness as such a frightening figure. The sight of so many young girls remaining passionately devoted to a psychopath, even when his depraved and murderous mindset seemed obvious to everyone else. It was clear that he had taken control of some of our children, and that caused fear among everyone who wondered, could this happen in my family?
All my feelings are good.
On January the 25th, 1971, Charles Manson was found guilty of murder. But eerily, he was all smiles.
At the end of the trial, he said to me, Bugliosi, you haven't accomplished anything. He said, all you've done is send me back where I came from. And he was talking about prison. Prison was his life. He was totally institutionalized. When he got out of Terminal Island in 1967, he was 32 years of age. 17 out of those 32 years had been spent in jails, reformatories, and prisons. And I said to him, well, Charlie, that may be true, but you've never been to the green room before. The green room is where they execute people at San Quentin.
3 of the Manson girls were also convicted of murder. Tex Watson was tried and convicted separately. They were all sentenced to death. But in 1972, California abolished the death penalty, and the sentences were commuted to life in prison. Dr. Stone considers whether the convicted murderers are as evil as Manson himself.
Tex Watson oversees the savage massacre ordered by Manson and takes great pleasure in butchering his victims. I rank him at 15 on my scale of evil, a psychopathic, cold-blooded, spree murderer. Susan Atkins gleefully stabbed Sharon Tate. Patricia Krenwinkel displayed brutality and viciousness. They would both also rank at 15 as psychopathic spree killers. Leslie Van Houten is harder to place. While she was convicted of murder, she was not at the Tate scene and did not necessarily inflict any fatal blows. While she certainly helped subdue the LaBiancas and facilitate the crimes, the stab wounds she inflicted on the victims appear to have been committed post-mortem. Therefore, I hold her less accountable and place her at a level 3 on the scale, non-psychopathic, impulsive people who act as willing accomplices with killers.
But judging these murderers is one thing. Judging the man who corrupted them, the killer who's come to personify evil but didn't physically commit the crimes, presents a more difficult challenge. October 1971. Charles Manson Tex Watson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel and Leslie Van Houten had been convicted of murder for the brutal Tate LaBianca killings. These were terrible crimes, masterminded by a brilliant psychopath. But for Dr. Michael Stone, ranking Charles Manson on his scale of evil is a complicated problem.
Manson has come to represent most people's picture of evil, but he himself does not commit the acts of torture and violence necessary to reach the highest level of my scale. Manson's evil acts come in the form of manipulation and control of the people who then do the murdering. The fear he instills to this day would presume a ranking as high as 22, but fear and evil are quite different. He never actually kills the victims in the Tate LaBianca murders. It is for this reason I place Charles Manson at level 15 on my scale of evil, a psychopathic spree murderer.
The guilty verdict didn't end Manson's evil legacy. 2 years after the nightmarish slaughter of 7 innocent victims, the Manson family was as strong as ever. It had expanded beyond its 24 core members as more young people were attracted to Manson and the media spectacle. Even with their leader on death row, true believers on the outside remained fiercely loyal to Manson. Their continued devotion to a crazed murderer only fueled Manson's mystique. The hardcore believers were desperate to free their leader. Several family members were arrested while attempting to rob a gun shop. It was rumored to be the first step in a plot to hijack a plane and trade the hostages for Manson's freedom. Catherine Scher took part in the botched robbery that turned into a shootout with police, but she denies knowing about a planned hijacking.
Were you or were some of the others involved in the idea of hijacking a plane and doing something in order to free Manson?
Well, I was in a shootout with the police. That was a big deal. That I did. I was sitting in a car waiting for them to come out. I got shot in the shoulder.
Right.
And then I went to prison. It's a bad place to be put into.
Yes, indeed.
Most people don't make it out of it.
Right.
I'm just extremely blessed to have a life like this. Most people don't make it out.
There may never be a final tally on the number of people who have fallen prey to Manson and his deranged ideology.
In his ability to detect weaknesses and fears in people and exploit those weaknesses and fears, in my opinion, he was a genius. And that is a precise reason, I think, why people are frightened of Charles Manson more than the average mass murderer. With Manson, since he could get other people to kill for him, the fright is exponential, and therefore he becomes much more dangerous.
No one likes to admit they could be brainwashed by someone like Charles Manson.
A lot of people feel that I would never have gone for that. I'm too smart for that. But it wasn't just some crazed out acid heads. It was people from all stratospheres. It was college kids and middle class kids. So it was a lot of different people from different backgrounds.
Manson is now in his 70s and remains behind bars, but he retains some of his power. He continues to attract and manipulate the desperate and naive. He serves as an icon for hate groups and receives more letters than any other prison inmate. Each new recruit is a reason to continue to fear Manson.
Manson's notoriety has catapulted him into an exalted place, if one can use such a word, in the ranks of serial killers. Other murderers since Manson have molded themselves on his example. His extraordinary ability, not just to brainwash people, but to spot weaknesses in them that led them to carry out Manson's evil intentions, was the quality that places him in a special category of evil. For almost 4 decades, Manson has been confined to his jail cell, an icon for those with a grudge against society. This is why